Deliver Us Mars is a third-person adventure game and long-awaited sequel to Deliver Us the Moon. Taking place 10 years after the events of the first game, you play as Kathy Johansson, a young astronaut on a joint mission to Mars that encompasses Earth's last hope with Kathy's own personal conflict. I want to make a quick note for people who are coming into this story for the first time without any prior knowledge of the first game. Yes, you can play Deliver Us Mars without playing Deliver Us the Moon, but I don't recommend doing so. You'll be able to follow the plot just fine, but a lot of the expanded context is found in the first game, which makes solving the mystery in this one a lot more satisfying. Plus, the first game is amazing anyway. Play that before this. Assuming you have played Deliver Us the Moon, however, one of the main plot lines that was left unconcluded was the mystery of what happened to the people stationed on the moon. With Deliver Us Mars, this question is one of the core focuses of the story, as their trail leads to Mars. To give a brief background on the lore of these games, Earth is dying. By the mid-21st century, the planet's natural resources have dried up, and the environments are fading away as a result of climate change. The planet's only lifeline came from the moon, after a unique resource was discovered there that could provide energy. This energy was then transmitted to Earth from the moon via the MPT, a unique tool capable of giving humanity the power it so desperately needed. Deliver Us the Moon focused on the MPT going dark, with your mission being to make your way to the moon, find out why it went off, and restart it. As I said before, Deliver Us Mars takes place 10 years later. While the MPT has helped, it isn't enough to stop the planet's gradual decline, with experts saying that before long, it'll end up becoming just as uninhabitable as Mars. This leads to a mysterious transmission sent by Isaac Johansson, a skilled engineer and scientist who was part of the mass exodus on the moon. One of the leaders of Outward, the name of the group that fled the base, he also happens to be the main character's father, whom she was separated from as a child. One of Outward's most damaging actions was the theft of the Arks, colony ships made with advanced technology that could help save the planet. What is a mission that has humanity's last hope on the line is also something of a personal quest for Kathy. So in part, the story is a sci-fi mystery/family drama, though that is a generalised viewpoint of it. The two things connect with each other smoothly enough that it doesn't end up being a surface-level conundrum or an overly dramatic soap opera. Alas, the narrative is without a doubt the game's primary focus. Similar to the first installment, the gameplay takes a simple approach in favour of delivering a cohesive and compelling story that contains impact, emotional twists and turns, some well-carved out character dynamics, and a few thought-provoking dilemmas. It's very much a cinematic experience inspired by many sci-fi epics. That's also where it might create some contention. It's important to understand what it is you're going to get from this game. It's not lasers and explosions. Well, actually there are a couple of explosions, but that's beside the point. It's a slow-paced experience, with a lot of dialogue and a few challenging segments. There are quite a few intense moments, but it's far from an action game. With that being said, I love the story. The characters were slightly irritating on occasion, and there were times where I questioned their capabilities as professional astronauts, but how they move past their flaws and differences is one of the main hallmarks of their character development, and it's done to excellent effect. It's longer than I was expecting it to be, certainly bigger than Deliver Us the Moon, and while I did say it's slow, the pacing is just right, with plenty of substance being given to each chapter to make them all stand out. I managed to finish it in 9 hours, and I did miss a few things which I'll get to shortly. I could have been playing at a leisurely speed, but there was so much to take in at times that it was easy to lose time. I also think the story wraps things up really nicely. I wasn't quite sure how it was going to end, and as a whole it was pretty difficult to predict how specific plot points were going to develop. The final act packs a lot of punch as things become clearer, but it never felt like it was unravelling too hastily. Is the story better than the previous game? That's tricky. I'd say this one is slightly better because there's a stronger character presence. Both narratives are about solving a mystery and saving the planet, and they're both equally compelling, but this one is made better when you've played through the first game, I think. Before I move over to the next section, I just want to go over some of the game's world-building elements. Again, very similar to Deliver Us the Moon, you can find notes, conversations, and scan different objects to learn more about them. They're pretty short, which is actually something I really like because I hate it when games give you massive paragraphs of text. There's plenty to find, and while they're completely optional, they paint a better picture of what the place was like before you got here. It's easy to miss some of these, which I did, but they're not crucial. The video recordings also make a return, with the same kind of presentation as before, where you can only see the shapes of people involved, which further enhances the mystery of the whole thing. They mainly revolve around the main narrative, so it's pretty hard to miss them. Okay, that about covers what I wanted to say about the narrative and the world building. Now let's talk about the visuals. Right, before I talk about anything else, let's address the elephant in the room and get it out of the way. The character models. I've seen a lot of discourse online about them, with some people going as far as to negatively review the game solely because of the way the characters look. I've read comments that their appearances take away from the story, which, as a story-based game, ends up ruining the whole experience. I disagree with most of that. Do the character models look rough around the edges? Absolutely. The hair doesn't look great, the skin sometimes looks like it's melting, and the animations don't quite line up either. That last point being a criticism I had with the previous game as well. However, I think a lot of this is caused by external factors, such as the lighting. On its own, it's beautiful, and the way it enhances the environments both indoors and outdoors is sublime. Unfortunately, when it shines on the characters, it can be hit or miss. I'm not a lighting expert in any regard, so I'm not going to even pretend to know why this happens. It could be related to the way the light reflects off the faces, but I don't know. I also think the angle that they are viewed at has an impact on how they look overall, since there are a few scenes where they look odd at specific perspectives. It's also dependent on the scene as well, since, in my opinion, half the time they look great. To go as far as to say that this ruins the game, however, I personally think that is ridiculous. There are moments where their faces take away from the emotional weight of the scene, sure, I'll admit that, but for me those instances were few and far between. I am going to be honest and say that I am quite forgiving when it comes to issues like this, unless it's for AAA games. This isn't a game that's had all the money in the world backing up behind it. In my opinion, what they've been able to achieve since Deliver Us the Moon is excellent, and while I do believe improvements need to be made across the board, it didn't take away from the story. Okay, elephant gone. Let's talk about levels. We've got a mixture of Earth, space, spaceships, Martian desert, Martian snowy desert, and various bases and facilities, so slightly more than Deliver Us the Moon. These environments are much bigger than ones we've seen before as well, with much larger scale and detail. In the beginning we get to see just how badly Earth has devolved. The planet looks ill, and the people living on it don't exactly look well off. We get a similar glimpse into how things were in the beginning of the first game, but nothing to this extent. Seeing all this helps set the tone and emergency of the situation. Things need to change, and sooner rather than later. In contrast, space is as tense as ever. You don't spend much time on the outside of the ship, but enough to feel the immensity of it. Then you have the spaceships which provide the opposite effect by making you feel constrained and sometimes dizzy. Since the majority of your time takes place on Mars, that's where most of the amount of work has been put towards, and it's safe to say that it's paid off. As far as Mars portrayals in media go, this is one of the best I've seen. Right from the moment you're on the ground, the atmosphere is nailed. It's barren, it's desolate, it's dangerous. The empty bases you can find also make it feel unsettling, especially in the quarry, which is the first place you go to once you're there. That area felt particularly creepy. This is also something I praised about the first game. The level designers have managed to create convincing settlements that actually feel like they were lived in at some point. The absence of any people combined with the lack of any obvious foul play not only enhance the eerie mood of these locations, but they also make the narrative as a whole more compelling. Deliver Us Mars never falters in that regard. There was never an area that felt too sparse or lacking in any unique features. There are so many layers to the places you're travelling to, and it was interesting and satisfying traversing through each one of them. Graphically, it is easily a step up from the previous game. Not that that game didn't look good already. This one is basically an improvement in every department, even if the character models can be hit or miss. I've seen some people mention that they had performance issues, but I didn't encounter any, though I'm pretty sure I did have ray tracing disabled, so that might have helped. Nevertheless, aside from a few rough edges, the game is gorgeous to look at and interesting to explore. As far as gameplay is concerned, it follows the same simple but effective gameplay loop that the first game had, although now we're leaning a bit more into the simple side of things. Regardless, let's get into it. I'm gonna be honest, there's a lot of walking, or jogging technically, a mix of both. A lot of your time is spent on a path with little way of figuring out which direction you're supposed to head in. You are very much on a guided route that's interspersed with puzzles you have to solve, as well as a few intense segments. It's a narrative-driven game first and foremost, so the gameplay takes a backseat half the time. But there are plenty of sequences where gameplay takes some of the dominance and lets itself shine. Like I said before, you're not getting loads of fighting and killing. Instead, you'll get quite a bit of climbing. I have a few thoughts on that I'll get to briefly. The puzzles are easily the most distinct part of the gaming experience, and there's a good number of them. They usually revolve around guiding power lines to direct energy into specific outlets. Over time, you're introduced to new tools that impact these situations differently, which helps add extra dynamics to the puzzles. They're not too repetitive either. In terms of difficulty, it varies, but there were a handful that had me occupied for a while. Either the developers did something right, or I'm just stupid. I can't tell the difference sometimes. I would have liked to have seen a little more variation in terms of the context of these puzzles, since, at least in memory, most of them were focused on opening doors. Alas, what was there was still entertaining enough for me. What was less enjoyable for me, however, was the climbing. There is a lot of climbing. For what it is, I don't dislike it. At its base level it's fine, and there are moments where it becomes a puzzle in itself, as you have to be careful where exactly you place your pickaxe. But there's too much of it. I felt that the game was too reliant on this feature at times. It's fun for a while, but when you've fallen a few times already, you end up wanting to rush through it. It doesn't help that it's a bit of a clunky mechanic as well. There were plenty of moments where it was difficult to control where exactly I wanted my character to go, not to mention the times where I thought I was okay to move, only to then plummet to my death. The worst moments are when you have to bounce off the wall you're on to jump to a different wall or platform. Surviving these just felt like luck, to be honest. I could never tell which way my character was going to go. Those are probably the standout mechanics the game has to offer. There are a few instances where you get to drive a rover, which is pretty neat. I didn't have any issues with the controls here, and you're given plenty of space to drive about, which is nice. One of my favourite parts of the game is actually near the beginning, when you're in space. Moving in zero gravity, relying on your jet thrusters to move about, was just so cool. I loved it in the first game, and I'm so glad they let you do it here again. It's trippy as hell sometimes, but it's amazing. Likewise, just like before, you go through the full launch sequence to launch yourself up into space. My inner sci-fi nerd relish these moments. I guess the question to ask then is this enough? And I struggle to find an answer for that. Overall, I really enjoyed the game, but what I will remember the most about it is its story rather than its gameplay mechanics. I would have welcomed more variable features, but for me personally, the story carried this game enough for me to look back at the experience positively. At the end of the day, it all depends on where your gaming priorities lie. Deliverers Mars has been one of my most anticipated games since its initial announcement. I mean, it made me break my rule on never pre-ordering games. That's how excited I was for it. Even though I have my gripes with it, the wait was definitely worth it. If you're looking for a well-crafted, narrative-driven experience, then this game will certainly deliver in that regard, no pun intended. It's got a captivating mystery supported by a diverse set of characters, voiced by a very talented cast of actors. It's got emotional weight that keeps you invested from start to finish. Sure, the character models look a bit wonky sometimes, but for me it never took away from the experience. As a whole, it's a beautiful looking package that perfectly captures the desolation of Mars, while also providing those unnerving undertones provided by the game's story. While I would have liked to have seen more variation in the gameplay loop, there's still a satisfactory amount of challenges that'll keep you engaged, even if it does err on the repetitive side of things. So overall, I can easily recommend Deliverers Mars, but more so specifically if you've already played Deliverers the Moon, because the story is much more interesting when you've experienced the world building in its entirety. Regardless, I highly suggest adding this to your list. At this point I usually give a score out of 10, but recently I've started to go off on numbered ratings, since the meaning of it is inevitably different to each person. If this backfires and people actually want a score, then let me know in the comments. Otherwise, I'm just not going to do it anymore. If you liked the video, then be sure to give it a thumbs up and let me know in the comments what you would like to see next. Until the next one, bye.